Hi folks, Stu here for what will be the final supplementary lecture for Med104 Engaging Media. And this time around we turn our attention to essay writing in preparation for the final essay that you have coming up in the unit. Now before I start, I just want to point out that this lecture is primarily designed for people who have not had any experience writing essays at university level, and I'm hoping that by the time you get, if you are one of those people, that you get to the end of this lecture and you'll be able to write a fantastic essay in response to the assignment brief for this assignment. However, if you are familiar or do have prior experience of writing essays at university level, I still hope that there are a few tips in here that will enable you to improve or refine your essay writing technique. So what is an essay? An essay is a piece of writing that presents and supports a thesis. So I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what a thesis is, but what's important to remember for the purposes of this essay and other essays that you're doing in your undergraduate work is that an essay set for assessment is primarily written for the tutor who will grade it. So it's not going to be published. It is primarily designed as a way of assessing whether you have been able to take on board, understand the ideas, concepts and themes that have been presented to you in this unit. Now that part about in this unit is very important. You may look at the assignment statement, and you may have plenty of your own thoughts about how you might want to respond to it, but you need to remember that at all times what I am looking for, or what your tutor is looking for, is that you have understood the concepts and ideas that have been presented to you throughout Med104 Engaging Media. So it's important to always keep this in mind. This is designed as a piece of assessment for Med104, and so we are looking for you specifically to draw connections with concepts and ideas that you have encountered through the course of study of this unit. So here is a model of an essay, and as you can see it's very simple, but it's pretty much applicable to any essay that you're going to write at undergraduate level. It starts out with a short introduction during which you're going to state your thesis. You then will frame an argument through the course of a series of paragraphs, and then finally at the end of your essay you're going to restate your thesis as part of your concluding paragraph. So an introduction, an argument and a conclusion. Quite simple. We'll come back to this model in a little while. Now there are a number of ways that university essays can be framed, but it's important to note that all of the essay topics for this final assignment for Med104 are formulated as discussion questions. That is, there is an assertion or statement made, typically a contentious one, that is followed by the word discuss. A discussion type question asks you to identify issues and provide points for and or against the proposition that is being made. So it might be that your discussion will completely support the statement. It might be that your discussion will refute the statement. It might be that your discussion will provide a series of arguments for and against the statement, and then come to some kind of conclusion which you will identify in your thesis. So that's how you write a discussion type question. So now that we've sort of established that more general framework of what an essay is, how it's structured, and what a discussion essay is, I want to move on now to the series of tasks, if you like, the process that you're going to go through the purpose of writing your essay. Now you've probably heard this one already in other assignments. It's particularly important in terms of essays in that you need to unpack the question and read it very carefully. Now again, this is time to go back and make sure that you look at the statement that is made in the essay question in the light of the themes and concepts that we have looked at in Med104. Okay, so that part of the, if you like, the statement in the essay question is implicit. It's not explicitly stated, but it is assumed that you will look at the question and consider it in the light of the themes and ideas that we've looked at in the unit. I suggest you go through, underline the key words, and make absolutely sure that you understand what the statement is saying in the context of the unit. Note the word count. In this case it's 1500 words, and all assignments at Curtin generally are plus or minus 10%. So you need to write somewhere between 1350 words and 1650 words. If you write less than 1350 or more than 1650, then you'll be penalized. It may be that you think that there isn't enough to write. It may be that you think that you can't condense all of your points into that word count. But I can assure you that this essay and this task has been designed by someone who's familiar with curriculum development, and that it is possible to make a very effective argument in 1500 words that will demonstrate that you have understood the themes presented to you in the unit. So having gone through that essay question, you want to make sure that it's absolutely clear in your mind what your tutor is looking for. Now once you've got that clear, you need to formulate what we could call a working thesis statement. So that is to say that it's quite likely, having read the essay question, that you have some of your own ideas about how you want to respond and what you want to argue in your essay. So let's talk a little bit about a thesis statement. A thesis statement is the single specific claim that your essay supports, and it's laid out clearly, precisely, and concisely states what the essay is all about. So you'll notice that I put my emphasis there on terms like single, specific, precise, concise. And that's because you need to be very clear about what your thesis statement is, because a weak thesis statement will almost inevitably lead to a weak essay. Now, as I mentioned before, this essay is a discussion type question. So you're either being asked to argue for the statement that's being made, against the statement that's being made, or to provide some discussion on either side. So look at arguments from either side. However, if you choose that middle path, what we don't want you to do, and what it's very tempting to do with discussion type questions, is to kind of fence sit. You still need to be very precise in your thesis statement. So, for example, a weak thesis statement would be something like, social media sometimes helps spread stories that are not covered by mainstream media, but sometimes it doesn't. A much more precise and specific thesis statement along those lines would be, social media assists in the spread of stories that are not covered by mainstream media. However, this is limited by the influence of mainstream media companies over social media content. Now you can see the difference there. Sometimes it doesn't. So try and avoid a vague or wishy-washy or fence-sitting thesis statement. Your thesis statement needs to be a single specific claim that is made very clearly and precisely and states what your essay is going to be about. Consequently, the thesis statement is the single most important part of your essay. With your thesis statement in mind, now's the time to do the first part of the real grind, and that is to do your research. And while you're doing that, as I say, you need to keep that provisional working thesis statement in mind at all times. As you go through your research, you're going to make notes and you're going to summarize as you read. And now you can see the importance of those tasks that we asked you to perform for the first assignment, where you were condensing quite large articles down to their key points and arguments. So you can take on board all of those techniques for critical reading that we looked at in the first series of tasks and now apply them to the research process in this essay. Now, I would strongly advise that you pay close attention to your note-taking while you're going through your research. You do want to avoid plagiarism, and by this what I mean is, as you're pulling out these key points and arguments from the papers, you need to be very careful when you're taking notes that if you are going to use the exact words that are used in the paper you're drawing from, you need to indicate that some way in your notes. The last thing you want to do is to inadvertently include somebody else's words in your argument without an appropriate citation or without quotation marks. And for that reason, it's best to paraphrase. So when you're doing your note taking, you're condensing, you're going through maybe 10, 20 papers, however many you're going through in order to get all of these key points and arguments that you want to summarize down into quite short statements so that you can then come back to them. I would suggest you consider using referencing software. This is software which every time that you pick up a particular source, you type all of those details into that software, and then it can generate your reference list and in-text citation for you. One of those is EndNote, which Curtin provides free for download for students. I can also recommend Bookmarks for Mac, although that is a paid application. And some of you may have experience with online referencing software, such as Zotero, and I'm sure I got that pronunciation wrong. But there are online referencing tools that you might want to use. Certainly if you're at the beginning of your university study, I'd strongly advise considering it, because they do make the process of referencing a lot easier as you go through your degree. So where are you going to gather your data from? So appropriate sources. And those appropriate sources are peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, peer-reviewed journal articles are accessible through the library database, and the important thing here is not necessarily the journal articles, but the fact that they are peer-reviewed. That is, that other academics have looked at what's been written and assessed it as being worthy of publication. Now, some people can find those university databases a little difficult to manage. There is a bit of a trick to them. If you're comfortable with them, that's fine. One cheat that I use is to use Google Scholar. So if you do a search through Google Scholar and you discover an article that you think is going to be particularly useful, you'll typically find that it's buried behind a paywall. What you then do is take the name of the journal and then go back to Curtin Library and type in the name of that journal, and using your Curtin access you should be able to access that journal article for free. Other appropriate sources are books by academic authors, and if you must, web articles by reputable academics. That is, you need to establish that if it is a web article, that the person who's writing it has some kind of substantial knowledge and authority within the field. But I would state that web articles are a kind of last resort at this level of writing. There are a couple of things I did want to mention here as well. News articles from the web. Now, the first thing to be clear about is that news articles are really not critical sources at all. But because we are studying a media unit, they can be quite useful in highlighting particular issues that the media are currently covering. So for those purposes and for examples, they can be useful. However, do read through the news article carefully and make sure it's not making any exaggerated claims. As we've seen in this unit, the nature of most legacy news media is that it tends towards the entertainment side rather than the objective information side of presenting. So use news articles sparingly, only when you must, and only use them as examples of what the media is looking at right now. The other thing to note is the use of business articles. So this unit is a unit in the humanities, but it's quite possible to find units, to find sources on the media that are written from a business perspective. A little bit of that business perspective is fine, but overdoing that can lead to articles or essays that really don't have much critical depth. It's important to remember that when you're studying at business school, that the bottom line is learning how to make lots of money as opposed to learning how to think critically. So whilst the use of business sources is useful occasionally, please try to use them sparingly. Your discussion of the topic will only be as good as the sources you use. You will only be able to offer in-depth analysis if you are using peer-reviewed critical sources. If you use web articles and news articles, you will find that the quality of your discussion and the depth of your critique or your argument will suffer, and consequently so will your marks. So there you go. You've got lots and lots of notes, you've read through lots of papers, and you've established lots of key points. You then need to really identify the broader themes in the research that you've done. So try to pick out themes that are related to each other, or themes which can be connected together to establish an overarching thesis. So you can see here that one technique for doing this is what's called a spider graph, where you start to pull together the various bits and pieces of the research that you've done and try and establish how each of the different points that you've found contributes towards the thesis statement, or at least the working thesis statement that you developed earlier. And now's the time to come back to that thesis statement. So establish clearly the key themes and points that support that thesis statement, and if possible, refine that thesis to be a little more precise. So in that example I used earlier, it might be that your working thesis statement is that social media sometimes helps spread stories that are not covered by mainstream media, but sometimes it doesn't, and I'm not sure why. Once you've done your research, you should be able to refine that thesis statement to something like social media assists in the spread of stories that are not covered by mainstream media. However, this is constrained or limited by the influence of mainstream media over social media content. So there you have a specific and refined thesis statement. Now, in some cases, it's quite possible that what you thought about a particular topic originally turns out, through your research, not to be the case. It's absolutely acceptable, and oftentimes it is necessary to revise that statement to reflect these new findings. That's absolutely fine. You haven't done any significant work, but you've got to use that thesis statement to guide your research. If it turns out that what you found is something different, that's fantastic. Critical reading and learning. So let's come back to this essay model again. We've now got together all of our key points, we've identified them, we've refined our thesis, we know exactly what our thesis is, and so we're going to start to write our essay. And surprisingly, we are not going to start our essay by starting at the beginning. The first thing to do is to write the argument, and that means writing the middle paragraphs. So, what's a paragraph? A paragraph is a standalone unit of thought with its own internal cohesion. So that is to say that I should be able to read from the top to the bottom of a paragraph, and it should say something very clear and specific that makes sense internally and not necessarily without having to be framed in the context of the essay. Consequently, each paragraph should make one and only one point. So you really need to limit yourself to 1 point per paragraph. If you find yourself wanting to make a new point, then that's the time to start a new paragraph. As a very general rule, a paragraph should be at least 100 words long. There are occasional exceptions to that, but for the purposes of this essay, I can't think of a good reason why you would have paragraphs shorter than 100 words. At the same time, you don't want your paragraphs over long. And so if you have a series of points that are related but can be broken down into individual internally cohesive points, then you want to do that, because what you don't want is a 600 or 700 word paragraph. Each paragraph in your essay, as well as being internally cohesive, should link logically to the next one. So there should be some sense of flow and rhythm that makes sense in your essay. This you can have established by looking at those key themes and seeing what ties together, such that your writing makes sense. Otherwise you end up with a disjointed series of paragraphs that don't flow easily, which makes particularly hard work for the reader. So how do you make that paragraph internally cohesive? Well, in essence, a paragraph has 3 parts. The best thing to do at the beginning of your paragraph is to introduce it with a topic sentence that clearly states the paragraph's main point. Now this is handy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it very clearly indicates to your reader, and then remember that your audience is your tutor, what the point you're about to make is, and thus clearly it should be quite clear how that relates to the assignment question. The other thing it does, and this is for your benefit, by putting that topic sentence right at the beginning of the paragraph, it enables you to identify exactly how that topic sentence responds to the assignment's main proposition. So you're very clear why that paragraph is there. Because in an essay of this length of 1500 words, you need to make sure that everything that you write is directly related to and responding to the assignment question. You really can't afford to waste any words by heading off on tangents here. So a topic sentence clearly establishes for you and for your reader what you are doing in the paragraph by stating the main point. The body of the paragraph explains, justifies, supports, elaborates upon, and gives examples which support that key point that was made in the topic sentence. Preferably, of course, almost essentially, with appropriate sources. Finally, at the end of your sentence, you want to wrap up what you've just said, and then using signposts, what's called signposting, or if you like, linking sentences, to establish some kind of connection to the next point that you're about to make. If you like, it's, as I say, the term is signposting. It makes the job for your reader a lot easier in understanding where you've been and where you're going. So that's a paragraph, that internally cohesive introductory sentence, a body that explains, justifies, supports, and gives examples to support your point, and then a wrap sentence that closes up the paragraph, perhaps by reinforcing the point, and then establishes that connection to the next point. Once you have put all those paragraphs together in a flow that makes sense using those linking sentences, now's the time to write your introduction. Why? Well, because until you actually wrote the essay, you didn't know what your essay was going to say. Now you do. So this is going to make you look very clever. The introductory paragraph sets the tone and frame through which the rest of the essay will be read. It leads up to and contextualizes the thesis statement. It should very briefly summarize the structure of your paper. Now, this is important because unlike, say, if you're writing a story, a narrative, where you really want to surprise your reader and they want to see how the story unravels, in academic writing there really shouldn't be any surprises. So I should be able to know from your introduction exactly what your essay is going to say, your thesis, and exactly how it is going to say it, your structure. So you should very briefly summarize the structure of your paper in your introduction, and you should absolutely include your thesis statement somewhere in that introduction so that it's very clear what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So how would you contextualize that thesis? So what is that little preamble that you might do in your introduction to establish the frame for what you're writing? You might give a little short historical background. You might outline the present situation. You might define some of the key terms that you're going to use. You might discuss some assumptions that are held around that particular topic, or you might explore a problem, that is, sort of look at what it is you're about to write about and maybe briefly describe why it's problematic. Now, any one of these things is fine, a mixture of them is fine, but you need to be brief. This is only a 1500 word essay, so your introduction needs to be of a suitable length. I would say somewhere between 100 and 150, maybe even 200 words at a push. But that's what you need to do in that introduction. You need to include your thesis, include a brief structure of what the key points you're about to argue, and contextualize that thesis so that your reader understands the kind of background to what it is that you're going to write about. So there you are. You've written your middle paragraphs. you've written your introduction, which cleverly says exactly what you're about to say because you wrote it after you wrote your essay. And then you're going to write your conclusion. And your concluding paragraph, in the same way that the introductory paragraph opens up the frame for the essay, the concluding paragraph closes the frame through which the essay's been read. So basically, your concluding paragraph is going to be very similar to your introduction, but in the past tense. So, in this essay, I have argued, as opposed to in this essay, I will argue. So that relates to your thesis statement. So you restate your thesis, as we saw in that essay, that summary essay diagram, and you re-summarize. So in this essay, I have pointed out this and that, and I've discussed this and I've discussed that. And in this essay, I have argued, and then you can use your thesis statement. The one thing that happens all the time, which is very problematic, is that people introduce new points in their conclusions. If you have something worth saying in your essay, you say it in the body. You don't say anything new in the conclusion. So never introduce new points. So in effect, your conclusion is a summary of your essay and a restating of your thesis. There you go. You've finished. Kind of. Referencing. It's everybody's least favourite thing about university, but it has to be done. As it mentions here, there is a in Blackboard under the help modules, there is one on referencing, which explains why it's important to reference in the context of academic work. I'm not going to go through why it's important now. I just want to highlight that you have to do it. Your essay should include in-text referencing and a reference list. If you don't know what that means, please go and read the help modules, which will explain to you how to frame referencing, how to use it, why it's important, etc. Do not include a bibliography. Some people get confused about the difference between a reference list and a bibliography. A reference list is a full list with full references of all text that you have cited in the body of your essay. A bibliography is typically a list of texts that have been consulted and not necessarily cited. Generally speaking, in your university work, unless you're specifically asked to provide a bibliography, you need only provide a reference list. So definitely for the case of this assignment, you only need to supply in-text referencing and a full reference list. Note that the referencing style for this unit is APA 6th edition, and I will post the APA 6th edition guide in the discussion board post when I actually announce that I've put up this lecture. So I'll be sitting there waiting as an attachment. I think it's actually elsewhere on Blackboard anyway, but at least this way I've pointed you specifically to it. You need to cite a source in your writing every time you do any of the following. Every time you paraphrase, that is, you put someone else's idea in your own words, you need to include a reference. Every time you summarize, that is, you put someone else's idea in your own words, but reduce it, then you need to cite a reference. And every time you quote, that is, you express someone else's idea in their exact words, you need to provide a reference, and you also need to enclose that quote in double quotation marks to indicate that it is somebody else's words. It's very important that you do this because, as I mentioned a little earlier, if you don't do this, you can run into trouble with plagiarism, which nobody wants to do. It's awful. It's awful. And I have to fill out forms. You know, I hate filling out forms. One important thing, and this is something that I first struggled with when I first came to university, but it's something that you need to get used to, is that you also need to provide a citation to substantiate claims that are not common knowledge. Okay? So it might be that you've learnt something in this unit and you go, well, I know this or now, so I don't need to reference it. Or it might be that you already knew quite a lot about computer games when you came to this unit, and so you start writing about computer games, you go, well, I don't need to reference that. I already knew that. Anything that is not common knowledge, you need to provide a citation for it, or your argument will appear weaker. Okay? So, Hopefully that's very clear. As I say, if you aren't familiar with referencing the whys, wherefores, hows to do appropriately, I strongly suggest that you go look at that help module, because referencing, when not done correctly, is something that can get you into trouble at university. Okay. Here's the next bit, and I strongly advise people that it's a good idea to, once you've finished writing your essay, to step away from it for a period of time. The worst essays are those that are actually written just before the due date on the day, because there is no time for cooling off. There is no time for effective proofreading. You know, the phrase can't see the wood for the trees. Well, that applies to essays. You need to allow yourself a little bit of time where you're not just thinking about your essay, and then you need to come back to it and see if it makes sense. You also need to proofread it very carefully. I'd strongly advise proofreading from a printed copy, not from the screen, because our eyes tend to skip over errors on the screen far more so than they do when we're looking at a printed copy. Go through very carefully, perhaps even use a ruler to check the document line by line. Read very consciously. And as it says here, don't forget that spell checkers are actually rubbish. Okay, it's funny, isn't it, how grammar checkers will pick up perfectly acceptable grammar, but spell checkers will sometimes screw up things they really shouldn't screw up. So read very carefully. One way of making sure that what you're saying makes sense, and particularly that the grammar is working effectively, is to read the document aloud. Even reading it aloud to yourself will mean that your brain will pick up on some awkward grammar if there is any there. Ideally, if it's possible and you trust someone, have a friend read through it for you. There's no rules against having someone read through your essay to make sure that it makes sense. Okay, we're not asking you, I'm not suggesting that you collude with other students in order to sort of make your essay better in terms of the analysis or the discussion, but just in terms of grammar and just checking that each point flows on from the next and that everything is clear. Your friend might say, well, hold on a second, I don't understand what you're saying here. This really isn't clear. You need to, that kind of assistance, it can be really, really helpful. And if you've got any doubts at all about, spelling and referencing, or maybe you've thrown in a word that you're pretty sure you know what it means, but you're not 100% sure, then, double check. It's worth spending that time to go through top to bottom a couple of times, because tutors are human, and it always, if something is not well proofread, it leaves a bad impression. It detracts from your work and makes it look less professional and makes it look as though you don't care. So be careful, edit and proofread, ideally after a short cooling off period. Okay, just a few little things now, as it says here, how to keep your tutor happy. And I'll just go through these quite quickly. The first one comes back to, again, I think the biggest issue is the business of providing supporting points when you need to substantiate claims. So even if you know something, think about it. Do most people know it? If they don't, then you need to provide a citation for it. Okay? Avoid generalizations. Okay? Pretty much everybody uses Facebook. Is a generalization. Okay? Try to avoid them. They're annoying, and usually they're incorrect. I think the most common one I get, particularly in internet studies, is anyone in the world can connect to Facebook. Well, given that only 40% of people in the world have access to the internet, that is an exaggeration and a generalization. So try to avoid those kind of things. Try to avoid cliche. You know what a cliche is because you've heard it before. They're great in some kinds of writing. They don't work in academic writing. Try to avoid colloquialisms, and that really plays to the one that's further down the list, which is keep your language formal. Try to emulate the kind of style that you're seeing in the journal articles that you're reading. You're trying to write quite formally, so avoid, and I think everybody knows what colloquialisms are, and if you don't, go look it up and you'll have learned something else in this unit, but try to avoid them. Don't write essays as you would speak, if you like. You are writing an academic essay and it needs to be in formal language. One thing that I find that I get quite often is rhetorical questions. So people who start off a paragraph by saying, "So, why is Facebook important?" and then go on to answer that question. Look, it's probably not going to lose you marks, but it's irritating and not generally appropriate in academic work. Your essay is supposed to be answering questions, not asking them. Okay? And one other one down the... Oh, sorry, avoid run-on sentences. Some people have no problem with this, some people have a big problem with it. Short sentences are always better than long sentences. So try to avoid the temptation to just throw in commas and keep going, or throw in semicolons and just keep going with your writing. Okay, short, direct sentences are more effective ways of communicating. Okay, so try to avoid those run-on sentences that take up half a paragraph. They're typically, the longer a sentence is, the more difficult it is to pass, and therefore the more difficult it is to make sense of. One other thing down the bottom there is the contextualization of quotes. People have a habit of just dropping somebody else's quotation into the text without any context. That is, as though it were a part of their writing, except with quotation marks in it. You always want to provide some context for your quotes, even if that's just, "Smith argues that," open quote, and on you go. So don't just drop in an entire quote as a sentence without providing some kind of context for it. This is really simple stuff. Somewhere, even though Turnitin gives me your name in the title of the document, I really appreciate it when people put their name somewhere on the document. It just makes life that much easier. So if you can, it's a way to keep your tutor happy, is to indicate your name on the document. Ideally, the font you're using will be Arial or Times at 12 point. I'll forgive 11. I get a bit grumpy around 10. Once we hit 9, I'm angry. Okay, I'm getting old. Line spacing, 1.5. 2 is fine, I can live with it. Single spacing is really annoying when you're marking a lot of assignments in a row. And one thing that catches people up is, please don't embed hyperlinks, and that includes in your referencing. And you'll notice that often when you add a hyperlink, when you add a web reference in Word, obviously you'll be using web references sparingly, but when you add them, that Word automatically hyperlinks. Please go in and I think it's Apple K to edit that hyperlink and get rid of it. They're annoying, and because Word doesn't handle hyperlinks very well, it's quite often the case that we can accidentally click on them and suddenly the browser's open, and it's just not appropriate in an essay to have hyperlinks embedded in the document. Okay, I'm hoping that through the course of this lecture that I've given you everything you need to know in order to write an effective essay for your final assignment for Med104. So, just to go through that again, unpack the question carefully. Develop a kind of rough thesis statement. Do your research and take care when you're making notes. Organize the research you've done into key points, and if necessary, revise that thesis statement or refine it. Write your middle paragraphs first, and we've talked a bit about paragraphs. Write your introduction and your conclusion, and then ideally give yourself a little cooling off period, and then proofread. I hope you found this useful, and I wish you the absolute best of luck to everyone in this final assignment. I look forward to reading your submissions. Good luck.